The auction. The marketplace was alive with strange sounds and glowing lights. Creatures of all shapes and sizes moved through the busy corridors, each one wrapped in mystery. Ethan, a human explorer, kept his head low as he wandered deeper into the alien bazaar. He was new to this world, but he had already learned one thing. If you didn't watch your back, you wouldn't last long. Ethan wasn't sure why he had come here. Something had pulled him to this hidden part of the galaxy, a feeling he couldn't shake off. He passed stalls selling exotic items, jewels that floated in midair, weapons that looked alive, and food that glowed in strange colors. But nothing prepared him for what he saw next. Ahead, a large crowd had gathered around a raised platform. The air buzzed with excitement and tension. Curious, Ethan edged closer, careful not to draw attention to himself. On the platform stood a tall alien with shimmering blue skin. His voice echoed as he announced the start of a secret auction. "This is no ordinary sale," the auctioneer declared. "Today we present a rare and valuable prize." The crowd roared, eager to see what was being offered. Ethan craned his neck to look. That's when he saw her. A young alien girl was brought onto the stage. She had delicate features, glowing violet eyes, and faint silver lines running down her arms. But it wasn't just her appearance that caught Ethan's attention. It was the look in her eyes. She was terrified. "This is Lyra," the auctioneer announced. "A unique specimen from the Erythian race. She is strong, healthy, and most importantly, her DNA holds secrets that even the greatest scientists have yet to unlock." The crowd erupted in a frenzy of bids. Strange voices shouted numbers, each higher than the last. Ethan's heart raced as he watched. He couldn't understand why, but something about the girl felt wrong. She wasn't like the other items being sold. She was alive. She was scared. As the bidding climbed, Ethan noticed something else. Lyra wasn't standing still like the auctioneer wanted. She pulled against her restraints, her eyes darting around as if searching for a way out. Ethan's gut twisted. This wasn't right. 50,000 credits, a deep voice growled. Ethan turned to see a hulking alien with dark scales and glowing red eyes. The creature's interest in Lyra seemed dangerous. Ethan didn't know why, but he couldn't let that monster win. 70,000, shouted another bidder, a sleek, metallic alien whose voice sounded like grinding metal. Ethan clenched his fists. The bids were skyrocketing, and the girl's fate seemed sealed. He felt helpless. What could he do against a crowd like this? But then, Lyra's eyes met his. For a brief second, her gaze seemed to plead with him. Something snapped inside Ethan. He didn't think. He just acted. 80,000 credits. Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. The crowd turned to look at him, their faces full of shock. A human, bidding on something so valuable. The auctioneer's eyes narrowed, but he quickly recovered. "We have a new bidder," the auctioneer announced, his voice dripping with surprise. 80,000 credits from the human. "Do we have 90? The hulking alien growled, his red eyes glowing brighter. 95,000. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He didn't have that kind of money. What was he even doing? But then he looked at Lyra again, and he knew he couldn't back down. 100,000 credits. Ethan shouted, louder this time. The crowd gasped. Even the auctioneer hesitated for a moment. The hulking alien glared at Ethan, his massive fists clenching. He looked ready to attack, but the auctioneer raised a hand. "Sold," the auctioneer declared, slamming his gavel down. "To the human." Ethan's heart sank and soared at the same time. He had no idea how he would pay, but he had just saved the girl, at least for now. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring about the foolish human who had just outbid everyone. As guards led Lyra off the platform, Ethan followed them to the back of the auction house. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? Why was she being sold? And what had he just gotten himself into? But as they brought Lyra closer, he saw the fear in her eyes slowly being replaced with confusion. and maybe, just maybe, a hint of hope. The claim. The silence in the room was deafening. Ethan stood frozen as the auctioneer's gavel struck the podium, the sound echoing like a final judgment. He had done it. He had won. But instead of relief, a cold dread settled in his chest. Every alien in the room seemed to be staring at him, their eyes narrowing with suspicion and anger. "You don't belong here," a gruff voice growled behind him. Ethan turned to see a towering alien with jagged, spiked armor, its reptilian face twisted into a sneer. "Humans don't play games they can't afford." Ethan forced himself to stay calm. "I just did." The alien's sneer widened, revealing sharp teeth. For now, Ethan knew he had painted a target on his back, but there was no turning back now. The guards escorted Lyra toward him, her wrists still bound by glowing restraints. Her movements were stiff, hesitant, and her violet eyes flickered between fear and confusion. "Why did you do that?" she whispered as they reached him. Her voice was soft, trembling, but her words were sharp. "You don't even know me." Ethan didn't answer immediately. How could he? He didn't know why. All he knew was that leaving her there felt wrong. "Let's go," he said finally, motioning toward the exit. He didn't miss the murmurs around them, nor the piercing stares of the other bidders as they walked away. Each step felt heavier, the weight of his impulsive decision sinking in. He wasn't just in trouble, he was in a galaxy of it. As they reached the edge of the marketplace, Lyra suddenly stopped. Ethan turned to see her glaring at him. "You don't know what you've done," she said, her voice louder now. "They won't let you leave with me. They'll come for you, and when they do..." Before she could finish, a loud crash echoed behind them. Ethan spun around to see a group of thugs pushing their way through the crowd. They were heavily armed, their weapons gleaming under the bazaar's neon lights. At their head was the hulking alien from the auction. His red eyes burned with rage. "There he is." The alien roared, pointing a clawed finger at Ethan. "Get the girl." Ethan grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her into a sprint. "Run," he shouted. The bazaar turned into chaos as they weaved through the stalls and alleyways. Vendors shouted in protest as merchandise toppled to the ground. Ethan's mind raced. His ship wasn't far, but they had to make it there before they were caught. "Why are they chasing us?" Ethan yelled over the noise. "Because I'm not just any Erythian," Lyra snapped. "My family." She stopped herself, her expression twisting with frustration. Ethan didn't have time to ask her more. He could hear the thugs gaining on them, their heavy footsteps echoing through the narrow streets. Finally, the ship came into view. Ethan pushed Lyra ahead of him. "Get inside," he ordered. As Lyra climbed the ramp, Ethan turned back. The thugs were closing in, their weapons raised. Without thinking, Ethan pulled a small device from his pocket, a stun grenade he had bought earlier on a whim. He tossed it toward the group and covered his ears. The explosion of light and sound sent the thugs stumbling. It wasn't much, but it bought him a few precious seconds. Ethan bolted up the ramp and slammed the ship's hatch shut. "Strap in," he shouted as he ran to the cockpit. Lyra hesitated but obeyed, her eyes wide with fear. The ship roared to life, its engines shaking the floor. Ethan gripped the controls, his hands slick with sweat. The thugs outside fired at the ship, their shots bouncing harmlessly off the hull. With a deep breath, Ethan activated the thrusters. The ship lurched upward, and in moments, they were soaring into the black void of space. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his chest heaving. He glanced at Lyra, who sat rigid in her chair. She looked at him with a mix of awe and disbelief. "You risked everything," she said quietly. "Why?" Ethan stared out at the stars. "I couldn't just leave you there." Lyra's gaze softened, but only for a moment. Then her expression turned serious. "You don't understand. They'll never stop hunting us now. You've made yourself a target, and I'm the reason." Ethan met her eyes, determination burning in his. "Then we'll just have to stay one step ahead." The escape. The ship's warning alarms blared through the cabin, their shrill tones slicing through the tense silence. Ethan slammed his fists against the controls, trying to override the system. "They'd locked onto us," he muttered, his voice tight with frustration. Lyra leaned forward from her seat, her glowing violet eyes scanning the flashing screens. "It's not just a tracker," she said, her voice low and urgent. "They're hacking your navigation. If they take control, we're dead." Ethan shot her a sharp look. "Care to explain how you know that?" Lyra hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat. "Not now." A loud bang reverberated through the hull. The ship jolted violently, throwing both of them against their restraints. Ethan cursed under his breath. The bounty hunters weren't playing games. Their ship loomed closer on the radar, a menacing shadow against the backdrop of stars. "Hold on," Ethan said, gripping the controls tightly. He yanked the lever to the side, sending their ship into a steep dive. Outside, the glow of a nearby planet filled the viewport. It was barren and rocky, with swirling clouds of dust that looked anything but inviting. Lyra's eyes widened. "You're not seriously thinking." "Got a better idea?" Ethan snapped. The bounty hunter ship fired again, the blast narrowly missing their left wing. Ethan gritted his teeth and plunged toward the planet's surface. The ship rattled violently as it entered the atmosphere, the heat shields glowing red. The alarms grew louder, each one screaming a different warning. "We're going to burn up," Lyra shouted, her voice rising in panic. "Not if I time this right," Ethan said, his hands moving over the controls with frantic precision. The ship's descent slowed as he activated the stabilizers, but the turbulence didn't let up. They crashed through the planet's thick clouds, the ground rushing up to meet them. With a deafening roar, the ship skidded across the rocky terrain, leaving a trail of scorched earth in its wake. Sparks flew from the damaged engines as the ship finally came to a halt, its frame groaning under the strain. For a moment, there was silence. Ethan's ears rang as he unbuckled his harness and turned to Lyra. "You okay?" She nodded, her breaths shallow. "What about them?" she asked, gesturing toward the viewport. Ethan followed her gaze. The bounty hunter's ship hovered above the surface, its sleek frame gleaming against the dull landscape. It descended slowly, landing a short distance away. The hatch opened, and a group of armed figures emerged, their weapons glinting in the dim light. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Ethan said, more to himself than to her. Lyra shook her head. "They won't stop until they have me. You should have left me back there." Ethan turned to her, his expression hard. "Not happening." Lyra hesitated, then reached into the folds of her tunic and pulled out a small silver device. She held it out to him. "Take this." "What is it?" Ethan asked, his brow furrowing. "A chance," Lyra said cryptically. "If you're willing to trust me." Ethan didn't have time to argue. He took the device and examined it. It looked like a simple button, but the way Lyra's fingers trembled told him it was far from ordinary. "Press it when they get close," she said. "And run." Before Ethan could ask any more questions, the bounty hunters began advancing. Their leader, the hulking alien with red eyes from the auction, raised a clawed hand. His voice boomed across the barren landscape. "Surrender the girl, human. You can't outrun us forever." Ethan glanced at Lyra. "What happens when I press this?" "You'll see," she said, her tone grim. The bounty hunters closed in, their weapons aimed at the ship. Ethan's pulse quickened as he stepped out onto the rocky ground, clutching the device tightly. The alien leader sneered at him. "You think you can protect her? She's ours." "Not anymore," Ethan said. He pressed the button. A low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. The bounty hunters hesitated, their expressions shifting from confidence to confusion. Suddenly, a massive shockwave erupted from the device, sending out a blinding pulse of energy. The ground shook violently as the bounty hunters were thrown backward, their weapons scattering across the rocks. Ethan turned to Lyra, who was already sprinting toward him. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice filled with equal parts awe and terror. A failsafe, Lyra said, grabbing his arm. Now move. They'll recover quickly. Together, they ran toward the jagged cliffs in the distance, the barren planet stretching endlessly before them. Behind them, the bounty hunters regrouped, their leader roaring in rage. As they climbed the steep rocks, Ethan glanced back at the chaos they had left behind. "You really know how to make an impression," he said, breathless. Lyra shot him a sideways glance. "You have no idea." The truth. Ethan stared at the holographic map flickering on the console, his mind racing. They had been running for hours, darting between asteroid fields and abandoned debris zones. But the bounty hunters were relentless. The small hidden moon they now orbited offered little comfort. It was barren, lifeless, and silent. Too silent. "What aren't you telling me?" Ethan asked, breaking the stillness. He didn't look at Lyra, but his voice was edged with frustration. "They're not just after you for money, are they?" Lyra sat cross-legged in the corner of the cockpit, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. She didn't answer. Her glowing violet eyes were locked on the viewport, watching the desolate moon below. "I've risked my life, my ship, for you?" Ethan pressed. "I deserve to know why." Lyra finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You think you've saved me," she said quietly, "but you don't know what you've dragged yourself into." Ethan's patience snapped. He slammed his fist against the console, the hologram flickering from the impact. "Then tell me, who are you and why are they hunting you?" Lyra stood slowly, her silver-lined skin catching the dim light of the cabin. She walked over to him, her movements deliberate, her gaze unwavering. "I wasn't sold just because my family needed money," she began. "I was sold because I'm dangerous." Ethan blinked. "Dangerous? You don't look like much of a threat." Lyra's lips twitched into a bitter smile. "Not physically, but my DNA. It's different. It's valuable. It holds secrets that could change everything." Ethan frowned, trying to process her words. "What kind of secrets?" She hesitated, then leaned forward, activating the ship's central terminal. The screen lit up, displaying a complex series of data streams and genetic markers. Ethan recognized none of it, but the patterns were mesmerizing. "I'm an Erythian," Lyra explained. "My race has evolved in ways most others haven't. Our genes adapt to environments, diseases, even threats. But I'm different, even among my own kind. My family discovered that my DNA could be manipulated to create hybrids, being stronger, smarter, and more resilient than anything the galaxy has ever seen." Ethan's mouth went dry. "And they sold you for that?" Lyra nodded, her expression hardening. "To pay their debts and save their own skins. They didn't care what would happen to me. They just wanted to survive." Ethan stared at her, a mix of anger and pity swirling inside him. "That's why they won't stop. You're not just a person to them. You're a weapon." Lyra's voice dropped to a whisper. "That's not even the worst part." Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. What could be worse than that? She hesitated, her hands trembling. "The bounty hunters aren't just working for my family. They're part of something bigger, something that's been hunting my kind for centuries. If they get me, they'll do more than just experiment. They'll use me to control entire systems, maybe even wipe out weaker species." Ethan leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. He had suspected there was more to her story, but this was on a scale he hadn't imagined. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Would it have made a difference?" Lyra asked, her tone sharp. "You would have left me back there." Ethan shook his head. "No, I wouldn't have." Their conversation was interrupted by a loud beeping from the console. Ethan turned back to the controls, his heart sinking as he saw the radar light up. A ship was approaching. Fast. "They found us," he muttered. Lyra's face paled. "We have to leave. Now." Ethan tightened his grip on the controls. "I'm not running again. Not until I figure out how to fight back. You can't fight them. Lyra snapped. You don't know what they're capable of. Ethan turned to her, his eyes blazing with determination. Then tell me how. If you want me to help you, you need to trust me. Lyra hesitated, then nodded. There's a data outpost on this moon. It's abandoned, but it might still have records about who's hunting us and how to stop them. Ethan didn't like the idea of landing on such an exposed location, but they didn't have much choice. Buckle up, he said, steering the ship toward the moon's surface. As they descended, Lyra glanced at Ethan. For the first time, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. You should have left me, she said softly. But you didn't. Ethan smirked. Yeah, well, I've got a bad habit of sticking my nose where it doesn't belong. The ship landed with a heavy thud, dust swirling around the viewport. Ethan and Lyra exchanged a glance, then stepped out into the unknown. The Alliance. The wind howled across the barren moon, carrying with it the eerie whispers of a long-dead civilization. Ethan crouched behind a jagged rock, gripping his blaster tightly. His pulse thundered in his ears, but his focus was sharp. Just ahead, the shadowy figures of bounty hunters fanned out, their movements slow and deliberate. They're trying to corner us, he muttered under his breath. Behind him, Lyra pressed her back against the rock, her violet eyes darting nervously toward the approaching hunters. They'll find us, she whispered. They always do. Ethan glanced at her, his jaw tightening. Not this time. From his other side, a sharp metallic voice crackled through a hidden communicator. Human, I know you can hear me. Surrender the girl now, and we'll let you live. Keep running, and we'll make this painful. Ethan snorted. Generous offer. Lyra's face hardened. They're bluffing. They'll kill you either way. That's why I'm not planning to surrender, Ethan replied. But if you've got any bright ideas, now's the time. Lyra hesitated, her fingers curling into fists. Then, with a deep breath, she said, There's a chance. A slim one. Ethan arched an eyebrow. I'm listening. She pulled a small, shimmering device from the folds of her tunic, a triangular object etched with alien runes. It pulsed faintly with an inner light, as though alive. What is that? Ethan asked, his voice low. A beacon, Lyra replied. If I activate it, it'll send a signal to an Erythian rebel faction. They've been fighting against the people who hunt us. They might come. Might? Ethan asked, incredulous. You want to bet our lives on might. Do you have a better plan? Lyra shot back, her voice sharp. We can't fight them alone. Ethan glanced around the jagged terrain. The bounty hunters were getting closer, their shadows stretching long in the moon's dim light. He cursed under his breath. Fine. Do it. Lyra pressed her fingers to the beacon. It emitted a soft hum, then a piercing light shot into the sky, cutting through the darkness. The sound of the signal was a low, resonant tone, like a heartbeat echoing through the void. Ethan winced. Subtle. Let's hope your friends are faster than they are. Lyra didn't respond. Her eyes were locked on the beacon, her expression tense. If they're nearby, they'll come. If not. Ethan finished her sentence with a grim nod. We're on our own. The bounty hunters, noticing the beacon, picked up their pace. Their leader, the hulking alien with glowing red eyes, barked an order. Secure the target. Don't let her escape. Ethan raised his blaster. Stay behind me, he told Lyra. The first hunter appeared over the ridge, a towering figure clad in dark armor. Ethan fired, the shot grazing the alien's shoulder. The creature snarled and returned fire, forcing Ethan to duck behind the rock. Any sign of your friends yet? Ethan called over his shoulder. Lyra didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the sky, searching. They'll come, she whispered, as if trying to convince herself. Ethan fired again, his shots holding the hunters at bay, but he could see the odds were against them. There were too many, and their firepower was overwhelming. He gritted his teeth, preparing for the worst. Then, out of nowhere, the air was filled with a deafening roar. A sleek, silver ship burst through the clouds, its engines glowing with an intense blue light. It was unlike any vessel Ethan had seen before, elegant and deadly. Lyra's face lit up. They're here. The ship swooped low, its side doors sliding open to reveal a group of armored Erythians, wielding advanced weapons. They leaped from the craft with precision, landing between Ethan and the bounty hunters. The leader of the rebels, a tall Erythian with a commanding presence, turned to Lyra. "You called us, and we answered. Stay behind us." Ethan watched in stunned silence as the rebels engaged the hunters. Their movements were fluid, their weapons devastating. Within moments, the tide of battle had turned. One of the rebels, a smaller figure with sharp features, approached Ethan. "You're the human who's been protecting her." Ethan nodded cautiously. "Yeah, who's asking?" The rebel smirked. "You've got guts. Maybe too much for your own good." Ethan chuckled dryly. "Story of my life." As the rebels pushed the hunters back, Lyra turned to the leader. "Thank you for coming." The leader's expression was grim. "We'll protect you for now, but this fight is far from over." Ethan stepped forward. "What does that mean?" The leader glanced at him, then at Lyra. "It means her enemies are more powerful than you realize, and if we're going to win, we'll need more than just luck." The confrontation. The darkness of the rebel ship's war room was broken only by the dim, pulsating holograms that hovered above the central console. Ethan leaned against the edge of the table, his eyes scanning the chaotic display of enemy fleet movements. He didn't need to be an expert to know they were outnumbered and outgunned. "This isn't a fight," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "This is suicide." The rebel leader, Kale, a towering Erythian with sharp, angular features, fixed Ethan with a cold stare. "You knew the stakes when you got involved." "I didn't sign up for a full-blown war," Ethan shot back. "I was trying to save one life, not take on an entire syndicate." Cal's lips curled into a faint smirk. "And now that life depends on us winning this battle." In the corner of the room, Lyra stood silently, her gaze distant. She hadn't said much since they had arrived at the rebel base, but Ethan could see the weight of guilt pressing down on her. "Lyra," Ethan said softly, turning to her. "What aren't they telling me? Why is this fight so personal for them?" Kale spoke before she could answer. "Because the leader of the syndicate chasing her isn't just after her DNA. He's her brother." Ethan froze. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. He turned to Lyra, his eyes searching hers for confirmation. "It's true," Lyra admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Ryan is my older brother. He always resented me. When he found out about my DNA, he saw a way to gain power. He convinced my family to sell me, but it was his idea from the start." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, trying to process what he'd just heard. "Your own brother sold you out, and now he's trying to hunt you down." "He's not just hunting her," Kale interjected. "He's building an army. With Lyra's DNA, he plans to create a new race of hybrids, perfect soldiers loyal only to him. If he succeeds, no one in this galaxy will be safe." Ethan let out a low whistle. "So what's the plan? You've got one, right?" Cal's expression hardened. "We lure him in. We know his fleet is tracking us. If we make him think Lyra is vulnerable, he'll come. But when he does, we'll be ready." Ethan frowned. "That's a big if. What if he brings more ships than we can handle?" Cal's smirk returned. "Then we make sure he doesn't live to leave." Before Ethan could argue further, an alarm blared through the ship. A hologram flickered to life, showing a fleet of enemy ships dropping out of hyperspace. At the center of the formation was a massive warship, its sleek design radiating menace. "He's here," Lyra whispered, her face pale. Cal straightened, his commanding presence filling the room. "Everyone to battle stations. Lyra, stay in the command center. You're the bait. We can't risk him taking you." Ethan stepped forward, his jaw tightening. If she stays, I stay. Cale raised an eyebrow. You're not a soldier. No, Ethan admitted, gripping his blaster. But I'm not leaving her alone either. Cale regarded him for a long moment, then nodded. Fine, just don't get in the way. As the ship shuddered under the first wave of enemy fire, Ethan and Lyra exchanged a glance. This is it, he said. You ready? Lyra's eyes burned with determination. I have to be. The battle outside was chaos. The rebel fleet darted through the enemy's ranks, their smaller ships using speed to outmaneuver the hulking warships. But Ryan's flagship remained untouched, its weapons cutting through the resistance like a scythe. In the command center, Ethan and Lyra watched the carnage unfold. Cal's voice barked orders over the comms, but it was clear the rebels were losing ground. He's toying with us, Lyra said, her voice tight. Ryan doesn't care about the fleet. He just wants me. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. Then we don't let him win. The ship lurched violently as an explosion rocked the hull. Sparks rained down from the ceiling, and alarms blared louder. A hologram of Cale appeared on the console, his face grim. They've breached our defenses. Ryan's boarding the ship. Lyra's blood ran cold. He's coming here. Ethan's grip on his blaster tightened. Good. Let him. The new beginning. The silence was deafening after the battle. The once mighty flagship of Ryan's fleet hung in space like a broken beast, its hull cracked and spilling debris into the void. The rebel ship drifted nearby, its engines barely functional, but alive. Ethan sat slumped in the cockpit, his blaster still gripped tightly in his hand. Smoke filled the air, and the faint hum of failing systems was the only sound. He wasn't sure how they had survived. His body ached, and his mind was a whirl of chaos, but one thought kept cutting through the fog. Lyra. He pushed himself to his feet, each step feeling heavier than the last, and stumbled into the corridor. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls. The memory of the final moments of the battle replayed in his mind. Ryan's face twisted in fury, the blinding flash of the detonator Lyra had triggered, and then nothing. Lyra. Ethan called out, his voice echoing through the empty halls. A faint sound caught his ear, a soft, rhythmic hum. He followed it to the ship's medical bay, where he found Lyra sitting on the edge of a cot. Her silver-lined skin glowed faintly under the dim light, but her expression was distant, as if she were lost in another world. You're alive, Ethan said, relief flooding his voice. He leaned against the doorway, exhaustion etched across his face. Lyra looked up at him, her violet eyes filled with a mix of emotions, gratitude, sadness, and something else he couldn't quite place. Barely, she said softly, but we won. Ethan stepped closer, dropping into a chair across from her. If you call this winning. Lyra managed a faint smile. Ryan's gone. His fleet is shattered. The rebels will rebuild. And you? Ethan asked, his gaze steady. What happens to you now? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her tunic and pulled out the same triangular beacon she had used to summon the rebels. Its glow was faint now, almost non-existent. I could go with them, she said, her voice distant. The rebels want me to join their cause. They think I can help rebuild what Ryan destroyed. But, Ethan prompted. Lyra's eyes met his, and for the first time, they seemed uncertain. But I don't know if that's my path. All my life, I've been defined by others. By my family, by Ryan, by the hunters who wanted to use me. For once, I want to choose for myself. Ethan leaned back, his expression unreadable. And what would you choose? Lyra hesitated, then stood. She walked to the viewport, where the shattered remnants of the battle drifted in the endless black. I don't know yet, she admitted. But I do know one thing. I can't run forever. I need to figure out who I am, beyond the DNA they wanted so badly. Ethan rose and joined her by the viewport. You've got time now, he said, No one's chasing you anymore. Lyra smiled faintly. Because of you. Ethan shrugged. I just didn't want to see you end up as someone else's weapon. She turned to face him fully. You didn't just save me, Ethan. You gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have again. Hope. Before Ethan could respond, the ship's comm system crackled to life. Kel's voice came through, steady but urgent. Ethan, Lyra, we've received a transmission. It's for you. Ethan frowned. A transmission? From who? Not sure, Kel replied. But you'll want to hear this. Lyra and Ethan exchanged a glance, then made their way to the command center. The console displayed an encrypted message, its origin marked as unknown. Lyra hesitated before pressing the play button. The hologram flickered to life, revealing a hooded figure. Their voice was distorted but clear. Lyra, Ethan, congratulations on your victory, but don't celebrate too soon. What you've destroyed was only a piece of a much larger machine. Ryan wasn't working alone, and his allies won't take this defeat lightly. Ethan's jaw tightened. Who are you? The figure ignored his question. You've disrupted their plans, but the galaxy's balance is still fragile. If you want to truly make a difference, come to the coordinates attached to this message. The real fight is just beginning. The hologram disappeared, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Lyra looked at Ethan, her expression unreadable. What do we do? Ethan smirked, a spark of determination lighting his tired eyes. Well, I've never been good at ignoring trouble. Lyra chuckled softly. Neither have I. The coordinates blinked on the console, a silent invitation. Ethan turned to Lyra, his voice steady. Looks like we've got a choice to make. Lyra nodded, her eyes glowing with newfound strength. Let's make it together.